Hello and welcome to this video on Transgressive Criminology, Globalization and Green Crime. As an overview, running through this topic are three themes: power, harm and the interconnectedness of the world. Today, nation states and large corporations have the power to inflict serious damage onto citizens, other countries and the environment. And yet often these activities and these crimes go unrevealed and unpunished. Some of these behaviours take us beyond the boundaries of traditional criminology into what is known as semiology, or the study of harms. This is because not all of these acts are considered illegal, yet they still injure humans or the environment. Some crimes and harms are without frontiers and borders. That is to say, they spread across the world with no respect for national boundaries. In traditional criminology, we are focused on exploring why some people commit crime and others do not, and we do this by comparing attitudes, behaviours and characteristics. But the key question remains: who makes the law and why are they made? This question was taken up by radical and Marxist criminologists. By the 1990s, a broader definition of crime and deviance emerged, looking beyond traditional constraints, which had defined criminology too narrowly. That is, considering the role of crime as a breaking of a particular law and criminals as lawbreakers. And so the notion of harm became open to debate. This gives birth to what is known as transgressive criminology, which goes beyond the boundary of normal criminology to include a wider range of issues. And here it's worth understanding for a moment the definition of transgress or transgression. It's a verb. It's to go beyond the limits of something. That is, to go beyond the limits of what is morally, socially or legally acceptable. So with transgressive criminology, we are going beyond the boundaries of traditional criminology, which we have studied in the various topics to date. Transgressive criminology breaks from focusing on the link between breaking the law and low-level deviance, but arguably, as we will come to see, loses some of its focus in doing this. The first subtopic within this topic is crime and globalization. Here we need to consider what is known as the global criminal economy. So in the same way that there is a global economy, so all the economies of all the different nation states around the world are now interconnected and interdependent, we now live in a global capitalist economy, we now also have, as a result, a global criminal economy. And David Held and others did some work on this. He argued that there has been a globalization of crime. Increasingly, the interconnectedness of crime across national borders raises big questions about how we deal with crime. And so what we're seeing here is the spread of transnational crime, that is, crime between nations. So for example, you might have a gang in one country engaging in some sort of crime that has links to gangs in another country that is also engaging in that crime. Manuel Castells in the late 90s identified a number of typical global crimes, which he said was worth about £1 trillion per year. Now obviously this is 20 years ago, so we would expect this to have inflated by quite an extent by now. The sorts of crimes he was focusing on included things such as arms trafficking, that is moving weapons across the world, as well as nuclear materials trafficking. 21st century slavery, people trafficking, trafficking illegal immigrants and prostitutes. What's difficult to swallow is the reality that today there are more slaves in the world than there ever was previously in history. Cybercrime, so crime on the internet. Sex tourism in developing countries. This is when people go from, say, the West into other parts of the world, in particular Asia and Africa, to engage in sexual relations with people in a kind of prostitution type basis. Terrorism. The drugs trade, which is worth at least £400 billion per annum. Castells argued in 1998, so once again we would expect this to have inflated by now. And money laundering, which is cleaning money that has been used or utilised or gained through crime, because ultimately every single bill or every single note is marked with a number, and so you need to clean it in a sense so that it can never be pinned back to you that you've engaged in that crime. So that's also worth roughly 1.5 trillion per annum, Manuel Castells argues, in the late 90s. Castell argues there is a supply and demand economic element to global crime, stating that most global crime is supply-side economics provided by developing countries feeding the demand being led by developed countries. So what this means is that in the West or in the developed states, there's often a demand for certain products or demand for certain services, and the developing world, or the third world as it was often described in the past, often feeds that demand with its supply. Best example is drugs. Drugs are generally made in third world states or in the global south, but they are generally consumed in the first world or in the global north. Marxist sociologists such as Ian Taylor believe that global crime impacts all social classes equally. So he's saying that it's very important to realise that at both ends of the social spectrum you will see crime. This isn't just a working class phenomena. However, amongst lower social groups, such as the working classes or the underclass, there's going to be a lack of legitimate employment opportunities caused by the outsourcing to cheap labour pools, which means illegal options become more rational. So in the West, what's tended to happen is people have lost their jobs down the lower end of the social strata because it's cheaper for companies to have those jobs done in poorer parts of the world where they can pay people less. And so what happens in the West is people think, well, I don't have a choice, so I'm going to have to turn to crime to make ends meet. Whereas amongst higher social groups, so here we talk about the bourgeoisie in Marxist terms or the middle classes and up, globalisation of money markets has led to an increase of insider trading, tax evasion and wide-scale fraud. So more of that kind of white-collar crime that we have discussed previously. Here we need to consider what is known as global crime and the relationship it has between gangs and what is known as muck mafia. Crime is locally based but with global connections. That's what the definition of global is. So if we look at the word, it's a portmanteau of global and local. So what you often find is whilst crime is obviously happening on the ground in a local area, it will have global connections. Hobbs and Dunningham found that although crimes have global links, such as drug smuggling, they still depend on a local setting, where to sell the drugs. The globalisation of crime include acting as a hub around which a group is formed. So you may have some local criminals who are selling, let's say, cannabis, but they're not farming cannabis necessarily in their own houses or in their own kind of territory or own locale. Often they are having it shipped in from other parts of the world where it's cheaper to do so. This then leads us on to the work of Glenny and McMafia. He examined organisations that came about in Russia and Eastern Europe after the fall of communism in 1989. The new Russian government struggled to sort the economy, and so prices of things such as food went up. So what you see is a communist state suddenly become capitalist overnight, and as a result of this, the cost of things went up dramatically, whereas previously they'd been heavily subsidised by the state or indeed were provided for free. Commodities like oil and gas were kept at the same prices, which were very low compared to the rest of the world, leading rich Eastern Europeans and Russians, known as oligarchs, to snatch them up and sell these at way higher prices on the world market. So what you had was those who had money in former communist states, those who had managed to perhaps through illegitimate means secrete the money away, now use that money to buy up large portions of the formerly nationally owned infrastructure such as oil and gas. They then sold that oil and gas on the world market to capitalist states where the cost of or the price of it was much, much higher. So they became multi-millionaires, if not billionaires, almost overnight. To protect themselves from violence and disorder, the oligarchs hired guards that were made up of ex-communist security and servicemen, known as the KGB. They were important for the emergence of Russian capitalist classes in the world economy. So because, again, the Russian state was now a brand new state, the police and the army didn't quite know what their role was yet because everything was being started anew and fresh as a result of the collapse of the USSR, these oligarchs basically hired their own mafia to protect themselves. These mafias or mercenary groups became famous for their efficiency and professionalism. They then began to brand themselves. They would, for example, have logos, they would have uniforms, ways of behaving and acting, and in doing so, they became known as that particular brand of mafia, of that particular brand of mercenary group. A good example is the Chechen mafia. What happens, therefore, is around the world, different governments, different businesses, organisations, different criminal groups, different warlords started to want to actually hire the Chechen mafia or hire one of these mafias. And what happened instead, therefore, was different individuals would set up their own franchises of that particular group around the world. So now you have Chechen mafias all over the world who will wear the same uniform, use the same logo and behave in the same way, even though they may not actually be made up of Chechens themselves. And so what you're seeing here is the globalization of a paramilitary group, of a mafia organization, of a protection racket or unit, and it's very much a product of globalization that this is able to occur. And so this is often referred to by Glennie as McMafia. In the same way that McDonald's is a franchise, so indeed, or increasingly so, are mafia groups. We next need to consider green crime or environmental crime. Green and state crimes are examples of transgressive sociology or criminology. Green crime should be a global concern, Albert Housey argued. Housey argued for moving the focus away from law breaking to a broader discussion regarding activities which harm humans' shared environment. So he's invoking here that concept of semiology, the study of harms. Housey said that green criminology is radical and needs to be radical. It is interested in the causes and consequences of the harm done to the environment, even when technically that behaviour is considered legal, hence again going beyond the borders and boundaries of traditional criminology. Unlike most criminology, it is concerned about harm to animals and the environment as much as harm to humans. So generally speaking, up until now, traditional criminology is always focused on harm to humans and their property, not to animals and the environment, and so here we see a definitive difference. Lynch and Stretsky argued that criminologists have traditionally ignored the study of environmental harm, as well as environmental laws and regulations. And this is often because there is no agreed definition of harm to the environment. It varies from country to country. So if every single society in every single state has a very different definition of what is harm to the environment or damage to the environment, it makes it very difficult to prosecute people when they engage in activities or companies engage in activities which harm the environment. And we need to remember that we as humans all share the same environment. We all share the same earth. So if someone harms it in one part of the world, it actually has an effect on us even here. And that is because we have the shared environment. So again, perhaps we need to consider harms rather than laws. Housey and White said that the notion of harm is inherently ideological and political, with competing interest groups holding views on this issue. Arguably, it is impossible to have a coherent approach to green criminology until there is a global standard regarding the environment. So, what does this mean? Essentially, if you have very rich businesses or members of the bourgeoisie, to use Marxist language, their view on what is harm to the environment and whether something should be considered a harm is likely to be very different than, say, someone who is living in an environment where they are perhaps engaging in a hand-to-mouth existence, or perhaps they engage in subsistence farming, that is, they farm to eat to live. And so for the first group, the bourgeoisie, they're all about making profit, and they're not going to want to introduce any laws that might harm their profit making. But for the second group, and here we're thinking about peasants around the world, perhaps in parts of Asia or Africa or South America, for them, if a business or an individual is harming their environment where they perhaps grow their food, this is really going to hurt them. So they're going to want to be protected by laws. They want this to be discussed. And so you can see why there are competing interest groups on this issue. And until we have a global standard, a global agreement, it's going to be very difficult to police. Here, Ulrich Beck introduced his idea of the global risk society. He said that the natural threats of the past are now less dangerous than man-made threats. So by that he means things like hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes and so on. In the past this was the big threat to human existence. Instead, today we can provide adequate resources for all through technology, but in doing so we have created manufactured risks or man-made risks. So today we now have the skills that we can for the most part protect people. We have the technology that if we wanted we could feed everyone, we could give them free drinking water. We don't do this because capitalism dictates that there's no money to be made in it, but the potential is there. One of the side effects of having this technology, however, is that we now have new man-made risks. These risks threaten all of humanity, and we do not necessarily have the solutions for them. A good example could be global warming. It's very difficult to punish those who engage in these transgressive crimes or harms, that is, engage in the activities that might cause these manufactured risks to come good or to be visited upon the human species. And so what we live in is a global risk society, which means that we all share the same risks. When something happens in one part of the world, it affects us. If, for example, someone is polluting one part of the world or polluting the water, polluting the air, it's going to affect us all because we live in the same ecosystem, the same microcosm, this same earth. So we live in a global risk society. Now, when it comes to understanding this concept of green crime and broadening it out to consider it in terms of harms rather than crime, we see that there's two very different views of harm and how it operates. Nation states and transnational corporations apply what is known as an anthropocentric or human-centered view of environmental crime. That is, that humans have a right to dominate nature for their own ends, and they should put economic growth before the environment. And up until very recently, this has been the dominant world view. Green criminologists, however, take what we call an ecocentric view that sees humans and their environment as an interdependent relationship. So environmental harm hurts humans also. So that's why we need to be aware of this and perhaps need to change our behaviours towards these harms. But as you can see, there are two very different views and therefore they lead to two very different types of behaviours. There are two types of green crime, therefore, as a result, what we call primary and secondary. Primary green crimes are crimes that result directly from the destruction and degradation of the Earth's resources, whereas secondary green crime is crime that grows out of the flouting of rules aimed at preventing or regulating environmental disasters. So, for example, governments often break their own regulations and cause environmental harms. In terms of evaluating green criminology shines a light on issues and concerns previously ignored, which affect people, animals and the environment, so it raises lots of very interesting questions. But it has not progressed very far since the early 1990s, when it first emerged as a concern. It also extends the scope of criminology so much that it is almost meaningless, drifting into more environmental issues rather than the very kind of narrow concept of crime and even slightly broader but still understandable concept of harm. Also, it is difficult to establish what harm is, which is arguably a more political, moral or ideological argument than a criminological one. And so what we've got here is that idea that perhaps by focusing on harms rather than laws, we lose focus on what really the focus of our study should be. That's it. Thank you very much.